Clara Bennett knew the orchard was being killed before she knew whether its owner would let her stay, because the first tree she examined carried 2 wounds that nature could not have made. One wound circled the trunk, where trapped water had starved the roots, while the other sat beneath the soil, hidden beneath gravel pressed into a drainage pipe by a deliberate hand. She had arrived at Moretti Orchard that morning with $27, a suitcase containing everything she owned, and an eviction notice folded between 2 horticulture certificates nobody had bothered to respect. By sunset, she understood that saving the trees might give her a roof, but proving who had poisoned them could cost her the only refuge she had left. The workers standing near the equipment barn did not know what she had found, and the tall man watching from the farmhouse steps had not yet decided whether she was brilliant, desperate, or both. Clara kept her fingers around the jagged stone she had pulled from the drainage channel, wondering why someone would spend years making an orchard appear naturally doomed. 3 hours earlier, when she had walked through the rusted gate beneath a cold Oregon rain, the property had seemed less like a farm than a place waiting for permission to disappear. Thousands of apple trees stretched across the hills, with branches too bare for late April, while abandoned blossom clusters clung to the bark like promises nobody intended to keep. Men in mud-stained jackets stopped working when they saw her, then exchanged the familiar glances Clara had learned to recognize during months of failed interviews. They saw a heavy-set black woman in a thrift store coat, carrying a cracked suitcase into a business that had already rejected consultants from California, Pennsylvania, and New York. The foreman, Walter Pike, approached before she reached the porch, wiping his hands on a cloth while his smile remained courteous enough to conceal dismissal. "We are not hiring," he said, in the tone people used when they wanted prejudice to sound like procedure. Clara looked beyond him toward the lowest rows, where the decline began near the valley floor before climbing uphill in an irregular pattern. "Then somebody should explain why your healthiest soil is producing your sickest trees," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the motel receipt pressing against her ribs. Walter's smile tightened, but before he could send her away, a black SUV crossed the courtyard and stopped beside the stone farmhouse. Every worker straightened as Adrian Moretti stepped into the rain wearing a charcoal coat that looked expensive without appearing decorative, his pale blue eyes moving from the trees to Clara's suitcase. He was not theatrical, and he did not need volume to command attention, because his stillness forced everyone else to reveal their nervousness first. "Who are you?" he asked, studying her face rather than her body or clothing. Clara gave him her name, then told him the orchard did not need to be replaced, although 4 consulting firms had already recommended tearing out every tree. Adrian listened without interrupting, while Walter recited the credentials of the experts who had failed, then asked Clara what she wanted in return for proving them wrong. She could have asked for money, yet hunger and exhaustion made honesty simpler than pride. "A place to sleep for 3 nights, she said, nodding toward the unused cottage near the eastern fence. A worker laughed until Adrian turned his head, then the sound died immediately. He asked what she expected to prove in 3 days, and Clara explained that diseased orchards declined through predictable biological patterns, while this one suffered in ways that suggested repeated human interference. She did not mention sabotage, because she had no evidence yet, but she saw Walter's left hand tighten around the cloth he carried. Adrian noticed her watching him, although his expression remained unreadable beneath the rain. "You get 72 hours, Adrian finally said, ordering Walter to open the cottage and provide access to the orchard's maintenance records. He warned Clara that confidence was expensive, particularly when spoken by someone with nowhere else to go, but she answered that desperation and incompetence were not the same thing. Something almost human passed through his guarded face before he walked back toward the farmhouse. Walter led her to the cottage without conversation, placing a ring of keys on the kitchen counter as though he were leaving evidence at a crime scene. Before departing, he told her Adrian had spent nearly $2 million trying to save the orchard after his mother's death, and that failure had made him impatient with miracles. Clara answered that she did not believe in miracles, then watched Walter's gaze drift toward the drainage map lying inside her open notebook. She began before dawn the next morning, digging beside trees in 3 different elevations and recording moisture, root color, soil density, and oxygen levels. The roots were pale and flexible rather than rotten, which meant the trees were starving while still biologically capable of recovery. Beneath 6 inches of usable soil, she found compacted clay so dense that rainwater remained trapped around the roots for weeks. Yet the original orchard plans showed drainage channels designed to prevent exactly that problem. Clara followed one channel through wet grass until she reached a basin hidden behind blackberry vines, where gravel and construction debris had been forced into the outlet pipe. The material did not match the surrounding geology, and shallow shovel marks beneath the moss proved someone had disturbed the ground repeatedly. When Clara removed the first stones, brown water began slipping through the pipe, with a sound like someone finally drawing breath. Adrian found her kneeling in the mud, holding the jagged stone while water moved around her boots. He had brought coffee and breakfast, although he pretended both were incidental, then crouched beside the outlet without touching anything. Clara showed him the shovel marks, the imported gravel, and the maintenance map indicating that the basin had supposedly been cleared 6 months earlier. His face did not show surprise, which frightened her more than disbelief would have. "Do not tell the crew," he said, watching the slow current disappear downhill. Clara asked whether he already suspected someone, but Adrian answered that suspicion without proof destroyed innocent people and warned guilty ones. As they stood, Walter appeared at the top of the slope, and for a fraction of a second his expression revealed alarm before settling into irritation. Walter claimed the blockage resulted from winter runoff, yet Clara placed the stone in his palm and asked which storm had sharpened gravel with a steel shovel. Adrian did not defend her or accuse Walter, but he instructed the foreman to leave the basin untouched until an independent investigator arrived. Walter obeyed, although the color had drained from his face. After he walked away, Clara noticed a narrow strip of red paint embedded in one stone, matching the old maintenance truck parked behind the barn. Adrian followed her gaze, then told her to keep working, as though nothing had changed. Clara watched Walter disappear among the trees, understanding that her 3-day bargain was no longer about whether the orchard could live. Someone had spent years ensuring it would die quietly, and that person now knew she had begun listening. By the second morning, Clara understood that the greatest danger on the property was not the man who disliked her questions, but the number of people who had learned not to ask any. Workers followed Walter's instructions without requesting written orders, invoices passed through the office without matching delivery receipts, and maintenance failures were explained as weather before anyone examined the equipment. Clara moved among the rows with a notebook tucked beneath her jacket, loosening soil around weakened roots, while recording every inconsistency she observed. She discovered irrigation valves installed backward in 2 sections, fertilizer concentrations strong enough to burn young roots, and pruning schedules altered after being approved by outside specialists. Each mistake could have been accidental, yet together they formed a system designed to create decline without producing a single dramatic event. Whoever controlled that system understood that slow damage looked more believable than destruction. Adrian joined her near the eastern slope after lunch, dressed in work clothes rather than the formal coats he wore around investors. He asked whether the trees had improved, and Clara showed him several buds that had begun swelling after the drainage channel reopened. The change was too small for celebration, but biologically significant enough to confirm her diagnosis. Adrian touched the branch with careful fingers, then asked why 4 consulting firms had missed what she found within hours. Clara explained that experts were often hired to answer the question placed before them, and somebody had repeatedly asked whether the orchard should be replaced rather than why it was failing. "People can purchase excellent advice and still control the conclusion," she said, watching his eyes harden. Adrian admitted Walter had coordinated every inspection, selected every soil sample, and delivered every final report. They walked toward the supply barn, where Clara compared inventory against purchase records while Adrian stood outside speaking with the equipment manager. Several high-value soil amendments had been purchased twice but never appeared on the shelves, while drainage pumps listed as installed did not exist anywhere on the property. Clara found newer records printed from the office computer, yet beneath a row of obsolete manuals, she discovered a handwritten ledger maintained by Adrian's mother before her illness. The older book contained supplier names, delivery schedules, and handwritten notes revealing that the same drainage company had serviced the orchard reliably for 18 years. That company disappeared from the records 2 months after Walter became foreman, replaced by Pike Agricultural Services, a business Clara had never heard mentioned. When she searched the address on an old invoice, she found only a post office box bearing Walter's surname. Footsteps sounded outside before Clara could photograph the page, forcing her to slide the ledger beneath her coat and close the cabinet. Walter entered carrying a box of replacement filters, then glanced toward the manuals with such precision that Clara knew he had come for something specific. He asked whether Adrian had authorized her to inspect financial records, and Clara replied that she was checking supplies required for restoration. Walter stepped between her and the door, explaining that people who arrived hungry sometimes confused opportunity with entitlement. His voice remained quiet, but the threat beneath it was unmistakable. Clara told him that people who relied on intimidation usually did so because facts had stopped serving them. For several seconds, neither moved, until Adrian appeared in the doorway and asked Walter why a delivery truck had left without unloading the equipment listed on its manifest. Walter claimed the driver had brought the wrong shipment, then walked away after Adrian instructed him to produce the corrected invoice before evening. Once they were alone, Clara handed Adrian the old ledger and showed him the connection to Pike Agricultural Services. He read several pages without expression, although his knuckles whitened around the cover. Clara expected anger, but Adrian responded with the disciplined calm of someone whose fury had learned to wear a suit. He explained that Walter's father had managed the orchard for Adrian's mother, and Walter had worked there since adolescence, making him more like inherited family than an employee. Accusing him publicly without complete evidence could divide the workers, damage pending insurance claims, and allow him to destroy records before law enforcement became involved. Clara respected the restraint, although she feared it gave Walter time to act. That evening, Adrian offered her a room inside the farmhouse because the guest cottage's exterior lock had been damaged. Clara refused until he showed her fresh scratches around the latch and a muddy boot print beneath the bedroom window. Nothing appeared stolen, but her field notebook had been moved from the table to the windowsill, and the drainage stone containing red paint was missing from her bag. Clara felt embarrassment before fear, angry that someone had entered the first private space she had possessed in months. Adrian did not minimize the intrusion, and he did not order her to remain on the property. He placed the cottage keys on the counter and told her the front gate would stay open if she decided the work was no longer worth the risk. His respect made leaving harder than pressure would have. Clara packed her suitcase before midnight, then sat on the edge of the bed listening to wind press against the windows. She remembered the nursery where she had worked until drought destroyed the business, and how management had ignored her warnings until thousands of plants died. She remembered interviews where men repeated her ideas after dismissing her, and the landlord who called her unreliable because the final paycheck never arrived. Leaving Moretti Orchard would be sensible, yet it would also teach the person sabotaging the land that intimidation still worked better than truth. Clara carried her suitcase to the farmhouse, but instead of walking toward the road, she accepted the small room beside Adrian's study. "I am staying until the orchard can survive without me," she said. Adrian looked at the suitcase, then at her face, understanding the distinction she needed him to respect. "Then tomorrow," he replied, "we stop treating this like a failing orchard and start treating it like a crime scene." The next morning, they contacted a forensic accountant and an independent agricultural engineer without informing the staff. Adrian instructed the security company to preserve gate logs and camera footage, while Clara marked every damaged system with coded flags that resembled ordinary restoration notes. Near sunset, she discovered one flag missing from a drainage site she had inspected hours earlier. Beneath the disturbed soil lay a torn plastic seal bearing the logo of Pike Agricultural Services, along with a recent receipt dated 3 days after Clara arrived. Someone was not merely hiding old sabotage. Someone had returned to continue it while she slept inside the farmhouse. Clara photographed the seal where it lay before touching it. then called Adrian from the orchard instead of carrying the evidence across the property. He arrived with the agricultural engineer, who documented the soil disturbance and found fresh tool marks around a valve Clara had repaired the previous afternoon. The valve had been loosened just enough to flood the lower rows during the next irrigation cycle, creating new damage that could be blamed on her restoration plan. Clara felt the accusation forming before anyone spoke, because Walter had already questioned her methods in front of workers who did not understand the technical details. Adrian closed the valve, preserved the seal in an evidence bag, and ordered the irrigation schedule suspended until every line could be inspected. Their investigation now carried urgency, yet the most convincing proof remained hidden behind paperwork Walter controlled. The following morning, Walter gathered several senior workers beside the equipment barn and announced that Clara's changes had caused unstable water pressure across the eastern fields. He spoke carefully, mixing accurate technical language with misleading conclusions, then suggested Adrian's trust in an unlicensed stranger threatened the entire harvest. Clara wanted to defend herself immediately, but Adrian allowed Walter to finish before asking who had loosened the valve after the engineer documented its correct installation. Walter denied knowing anything about the tampering, then claimed Clara might have damaged it accidentally and invented sabotage to protect herself. Murmurs moved through the crew, revealing how easily doubt could replace evidence when people feared losing their livelihoods. Clara realized the confrontation was not designed to remove her alone. Walter wanted the workers to believe restoration itself had become dangerous. Instead of arguing, Clara asked everyone to follow her to 3 marked trees positioned above, beside, and below the altered valve. She cut narrow inspection windows into the soil and demonstrated that oxygen levels had improved wherever drainage remained untouched, while the single flooded section showed disturbance less than 12 hours old. She then displayed time-stamped photographs from the engineer's inspection, proving the valve had been secured before sunset. Her explanation remained practical rather than emotional, and several workers began asking why Walter had blamed her before reviewing the evidence. Walter answered that leadership required making decisions quickly, but the phrase sounded weaker after years of unexplained failures. Adrian announced that Clara would oversee all orchard health decisions, while the financial and maintenance audit continued. Walter did not protest, although his expression promised that silence would not mean surrender. Later that afternoon, a white pickup arrived carrying Samuel Henderson, the former nursery owner who had trained Clara during her first horticulture job. He had located her through a former co-worker and brought an offer to manage a newly purchased Washington orchard with a salary, housing, insurance, and full authority. The opportunity represented everything Clara had lost, including stability she could accept, without sleeping near a man who had searched her room. Samuel gave her 24 hours to decide, then warned that loyalty to damaged places sometimes became another name for refusing to save oneself. His words unsettled her, because they contained enough truth to hurt. She placed the offer beside her toolbox, believing the choice concerned employment, until Adrian found the envelope and quietly told her she should take it. Clara expected him to ask her to stay, and his refusal to do so exposed how much she had begun wanting that request. Adrian explained that he would never make her future the price of helping him repair his past, especially when danger had entered her room because of his investigation. He promised to complete the restoration with outside specialists and told her the evidence she had collected would remain protected. Clara accused him of treating departure as generosity because disappointment frightened him more than loss, then regretted the words when pain crossed his face. Adrian admitted his mother had died after years of refusing help, and he had learned to respect leaving before sacrifice became resentment. Their disagreement ended without resolution, leaving Clara alone among trees that needed her expertise but not necessarily her life. That evening, the forensic accountant called Adrian with a discovery that changed the investigation. Pike Agricultural Services had received more than $800,000 through inflated contracts, yet Walter owned only a minor share of the company. The controlling owner was Adrian Moretti, Adrian's aunt and the family trustee who had managed the orchard's finances during his mother's illness. Evelyn lived in Portland, attended every annual harvest celebration, and had repeatedly encouraged Adrian to sell the property to a development group after declaring the orchard financially unsustainable. Walter had benefited from the scheme, but he lacked authority to approve the duplicate payments or manipulate insurance valuations. The betrayal reached beyond an employee Adrian considered family. It came from the person who had advised him through his mother's death. Adrian showed Clara the records in his study, while rain moved against the windows. He explained that Evelyn had inherited a minority interest in the land, but could force a sale if the orchard posted losses for 3 consecutive years, and Adrian failed to meet repayment obligations attached to the estate. The current season represented the final year required to trigger that clause. If the orchard recovered before the harvest valuation, Evelyn's plan would collapse, which explained why the sabotage had resumed after Clara arrived. Clara understood that Walter was dangerous because exposure threatened his income, but Evelyn possessed something more powerful than fear, a legal mechanism that rewarded failure. Adrian had spent years pouring money into symptoms, while his own trustee converted every rescue attempt into evidence of incompetence. Clara opened Samuel's offer and read it again, seeing security on every page and unfinished consequences outside the window. She knew staying could no longer be justified by attachment to trees alone, because Evelyn's fraud might eventually be proven without her. What remained unique was Clara's ability to restore enough of the orchard before the valuation inspection scheduled in 19 days. Without measurable biological improvement, the estate clause could still activate while criminal charges moved slowly through the courts. Clara declined the Washington job the next morning, but she refused Adrian's gratitude and demanded a formal contract, independent authority, and professional compensation rather than shelter disguised as employment. Adrian accepted every condition without negotiation. For the first time, Clara did not ask permission to belong. She established the terms under which her knowledge would be respected. By the end of the week, recovery accelerated across the lower fields. Yet a new problem appeared in laboratory tests. Several trees contained traces of an herbicide never approved for use anywhere on the property. The chemical had entered through a fertilizer batch delivered 2 months earlier, and the supplier invoice carried Evelyn's authorization. Clara examined the affected rows and realized the contamination formed a path toward the oldest section of the orchard, where Adrian's mother had planted the original trees. Whoever had chosen the target understood that destroying those trees would injure more than the harvest. It would break Adrian's reason for refusing to sell. The contaminated fertilizer could not be removed from the soil quickly enough to protect every tree, so Clara designed a recovery plan that required sacrificing part of the season to preserve the orchard's future. She ordered irrigation reduced in the affected rows, introduced activated carbon around the root zones, and diverted healthy blossoms from producing fruit so the trees could spend their remaining energy surviving. Several workers resisted removing young apples from branches after years of poor harvests, because every fruit represented income they desperately needed. Clara explained that keeping a small crop today could kill the trees before next spring, while temporary loss might preserve decades of production. Her decision created the first genuine conflict between hope and discipline, forcing her to become more than the outsider who discovered problems. She now carried responsibility for consequences people could see immediately, while success remained months away. Walter exploited that uncertainty by telling workers Clara's plan would reduce their harvest bonuses and strengthen Evelyn's argument that the orchard had become unprofitable. He never openly encouraged rebellion, but he asked questions designed to make fear sound like common sense. Why destroy healthy fruit? Because laboratory numbers suggested invisible poison. Why trust someone who had been homeless weeks earlier over managers who had spent their lives on the property? Clara heard the whispers and understood that technical accuracy would not restore trust by itself. During an evening meeting, she placed her projected losses, recovery probabilities, and worst-case assumptions on a table, then invited every worker to challenge them. She admitted where she could be wrong, which surprised people accustomed to leaders who protected authority by pretending certainty. An older irrigation mechanic named Luis Ortega asked whether employees would lose wages if the harvest declined. Adrian answered before Clara could, guaranteeing every seasonal worker full contracted pay from his personal funds. Walter accused him of risking the estate for emotional reasons, and Adrian replied that workers should not finance crimes committed by management. The room shifted after that sentence, because loyalty became easier when leadership accepted the cost of its own decisions. Luis then revealed that Walter had ordered him to bypass 2 filtration alarms the previous winter, claiming replacement sensors were delayed. He had obeyed because Walter threatened to eliminate his position, but he still possessed text messages containing the instructions. Another worker recalled seeing Evelyn's driver near the fertilizer shed on a weekend when no delivery was scheduled. The investigation gained witnesses, yet Adrian resisted confronting Evelyn until the accountant secured original bank records and the engineer confirmed the contamination chain. Clara admired his patience while recognizing the emotional damage it concealed. One evening she found him sitting on a bench above the oldest rose, holding a photograph of his mother beneath the first tree she had planted. He explained that Evelyn had cared for his mother during her illness, managed medications, and handled every legal decision Adrian felt too young to understand. Believing she had exploited that trust forced him to reconsider years of family memories, including moments that had once felt compassionate. Clara did not tell him betrayal revealed that every kindness had been false, because human beings rarely divided so neatly. She suggested Evelyn might have loved his mother and still convinced herself that Adrian was wasting valuable land. Their conversation deepened when Adrian admitted the orchard had become his measure of personal worth. Every dying tree felt like proof that he had failed the final promise made beside his mother's hospital bed, while every expert recommendation sounded like permission to stop caring. Clara recognized the same wound that had followed her after the nursery closed, when unemployment transformed a failed business into a verdict about her usefulness. She told Adrian that responsibility meant answering for choices within his control, not accepting blame for damage another person deliberately concealed. He asked whether she believed that principle when judging herself, and she could not answer honestly. The silence between them became intimate without romance being declared, because both understood that saving the orchard had begun exposing places inside them that competence alone could not repair. 3 days before the estate valuation, Evelyn arrived unexpectedly in a silver sedan, carrying legal documents and the composed warmth of someone accustomed to entering rooms as family rather than threat. She embraced Adrian, greeted workers by name, and praised Clara for producing encouraging cosmetic improvement. Her language reduced living recovery to appearance while preserving plausible politeness. During lunch, Evelyn explained that the development group's offer would erase Adrian's debts, provide severance for employees, and convert part of the property into a public park honoring his mother. The proposal sounded compassionate because it transformed surrender into memorial. Clara watched Adrian listen without revealing what he knew, while Evelyn's attention repeatedly moved toward the oldest rose. After lunch, Evelyn requested a private tour with Clara, claiming she wanted to understand the restoration. Among the trees, she spoke admiringly about Clara's talent, then offered her a consulting position with the development group at 3 times her new salary. Clara asked whether the offer depended on the orchard failing its valuation, and Evelyn smiled, as though the question displayed unnecessary suspicion. She argued that land changed, industries disappeared, and intelligent people recognized when loyalty became waste. Clara replied that change caused by economics differed from failure manufactured through fraud. Evelyn's expression remained pleasant, yet the warmth left her eyes. "Be careful," she said, "because Adrian confuses anyone who saves him with someone he can trust forever." That warning lingered after Evelyn returned to the farmhouse, not because Clara believed it, but because it revealed Evelyn understood the growing bond between them. Near midnight, the security system failed across the western fields for 11 minutes. When cameras returned, smoke was rising from the records shed, where original maintenance logs and fertilizer receipts had been moved for preservation. Workers contained the fire before it reached the main barn, but several boxes were destroyed. Walter disappeared during the confusion, and Adrian's vehicle was found with a severed brake line near the lower road. The sabotage had escalated from trees to people, eliminating any illusion that Evelyn's plan remained a financial crime without human danger. Police located Walter before dawn at a motel 40 miles away, carrying cash, a new phone, and a one-way airline reservation purchased under another name. During questioning, he denied setting the fire, but admitted Evelyn had paid him to manipulate drainage, inventories, and consultant access. He claimed she promised the orchard would be sold before anyone suffered permanent harm, then insisted the brake line had never been part of their agreement. His confession implicated Evelyn in fraud and agricultural sabotage, yet the fire and attempted injury required stronger evidence. Walter provided access to an encrypted account containing years of instructions, but the most recent messages had been deleted remotely. Evelyn remained free, and the estate valuation was now less than 48 hours away. Clara returned to the oldest rows after sunrise and discovered that several trees had been cut deeply near their root crowns during the blackout. The damage was not immediately fatal, but it could cause visible collapse during the inspector's visit. As she examined the cuts, she found a small piece of fabric caught beneath the bark, woven from the same cream-colored coat Evelyn had worn during their private tour. Clara placed it into an evidence bag, understanding that the woman had not merely directed destruction from a distance. Evelyn had walked among the trees her sister planted and wounded them with her own hands. The fabric connected Evelyn to the orchard, but Adrian knew a torn thread would not prove who held the tool or establish intent beyond reasonable doubt. He wanted to cancel the valuation and request an emergency court injunction, yet the estate attorneys warned that delay could itself trigger the sale provision unless they demonstrated immediate financial recovery. Clara proposed a more difficult strategy: repair the damaged trees well enough to survive inspection, present independent biological evidence of systematic sabotage, and prove that projected losses resulted from criminal interference rather than operational failure. Success required workers to restore nearly 400 acres in 36 hours, while preserving every compromised site for investigators. Failure would allow Evelyn to claim Adrian had invented sabotage after years of mismanagement. The orchard's future now depended on both truth and performance, because legal systems often demanded measurable proof before recognizing moral reality. Adrian gathered the entire crew and described Walter's confession without concealing how badly he had misjudged someone trusted for decades. He accepted responsibility for ignoring complaints, allowing one manager to control records, and treating family loyalty as a substitute for oversight. The admission changed the atmosphere more than anger would have, because workers saw a leader willing to stand inside his own failure rather than above it. Luis organized drainage teams, younger workers documented every repair, and families arrived with food as the restoration continued through the night. Clara moved from row to row, teaching crews how to seal root wounds, stabilize soil, and redirect irrigation without destroying evidence. Exhaustion blurred the hours, yet the orchard no longer felt like Adrian's private burden or Clara's desperate opportunity. It had become a shared refusal to let deception decide what deserved to survive. Shortly before dawn, Clara collapsed beside a utility cart after standing for nearly 20 hours. Adrian found her trying to rise and ordered her inside, but she refused until he reminded her that destroying herself would not make the work more meaningful. His words echoed Samuel's warning about damaged places becoming an excuse for self-erasure. Clara allowed him to guide her toward the farmhouse, frustrated by tears that arrived only after her body stopped moving. In the kitchen, Adrian cleaned soil from a cut on her palm while she admitted that usefulness had become the only argument she trusted for deserving stability. He told her the orchard needed her judgment, not her suffering, and that staying by choice differed from proving she could endure anything. Their hands remained together after the bandage was secured, neither pretending the moment was only practical. Clara slept for 3 hours, then returned to find the oldest rows supported with protective wraps and temporary braces. White inspection flags marked every damaged root crown, while separate red flags identified healthy control trees for comparison. The estate evaluator arrived at noon, accompanied by attorneys, an insurance representative, and Evelyn, who wore a navy suit instead of the damaged cream coat. She expressed shock when police officers requested her outerwear for forensic examination, then accused Adrian of staging accusations to prevent the sale. The evaluator refused to suspend the process, explaining that his duty concerned the orchard's condition rather than criminal liability. Evelyn appeared relieved, believing biological decline would speak louder than incomplete evidence. Clara intended to make the trees speak accurately for the first time. She guided the group through restored drainage channels, laboratory results, historical maps, and sections where identical varieties showed dramatically different health, based on access to Walter's altered systems. The engineer demonstrated that compacted soil, reversed valves, and contaminated fertilizer could not result from normal neglect alone. The accountant traced payments from the estate to Evelyn's holding company through Pike Agricultural Services, while Walter's recorded statement described how consultants received prepared samples from unaffected rows. Evelyn dismissed him as a frightened employee bargaining for leniency, which remained legally possible. Then Luis produced his original text messages, including one instruction telling him to disable an alarm before Evelyn's driver delivered fertilizer. The pattern became difficult to explain as coincidence. Although Evelyn continued insisting Adrian had misunderstood legitimate cost reductions. The final evidence came from a source nobody expected. Mrs. Alvarez, Adrian's mother's former housekeeper, arrived carrying a sealed envelope she had kept for 7 years. She explained that Adrian's mother became suspicious after orchard expenses rose during her illness and asked Mrs. Alvarez to preserve copies of several documents outside the farmhouse. Inside were letters written by Evelyn, proposing that the orchard be intentionally allowed to decline so a development sale could protect the family's remaining capital. Adrian's mother had rejected the plan and instructed her attorney to revise the trust, but she died before signing the final amendment. One handwritten note stated that Evelyn believed Adrian's emotional attachment would eventually ruin him, and that she intended to intervene if he refused to sell. The letters established motive years before Walter's scheme began. Evelyn's composure finally fractured, although she did not deny writing the proposal. She argued that her sister had been dying, Adrian had been grieving, and the orchard consumed money that could have protected the family. She admitted authorizing pressure tactics, but insisted every decision had been intended to force a necessary sale, not destroy lives. Adrian asked whether cutting his brake line belonged to her definition of protection. Evelyn looked toward Walter's empty place among the workers and claimed she never ordered physical harm. Police informed her that deleted messages recovered from Walter's phone included instructions to create an accident serious enough to remove Adrian from the inspection. The wording stopped short of naming a method, yet its meaning required no imagination. As officers moved toward her, Evelyn turned to Clara and accused her of manipulating Adrian because desperation made her skilled at appearing indispensable. Clara felt the old shame rise, then recognized it as a weapon that worked only when she accepted another person's definition of her worth. She replied that saving the orchard had not made her valuable, because knowledge, judgment, and character existed before anyone on the property recognized them. Adrian did not speak for her, which mattered more than defending her would have. Evelyn was arrested on charges related to fraud, conspiracy, tampering, and reckless endangerment, while investigators continued determining responsibility for the fire and brake line. The evaluator completed his inspection as evening settled across the hills. His decision arrived before sunset. The orchard remained economically viable. The decline resulted primarily from documented interference, and projected recovery exceeded the threshold required to block the forced sale clause. Workers cheered, yet Clara felt no triumphant release because damaged trees still surrounded them. Walter's betrayal had broken decades of trust, and Adrian had lost the last uncomplicated version of his family. The victory felt worthy precisely because it did not erase the cost. As the crowd dispersed, Adrian stood beneath his mother's oldest tree and asked Clara what happened next. She looked across the rows, understanding that surviving a crisis did not automatically teach people how to live afterward. "Now," she said, "we build something that does not depend on one person noticing everything before it is too late." Over the following 6 months, Moretti Orchard changed through decisions less dramatic than sabotage but more important to its future. Adrian created independent financial oversight, anonymous employee reporting, rotating vendor reviews, and shared maintenance records that no single manager could alter. Clara established a restoration department employing local horticulture graduates, experienced farm workers, and apprentices who lacked traditional credentials but demonstrated practical knowledge. Luis became operations director after initially refusing the title, insisting he had spent too many years believing silence protected his family. Adrian persuaded him that leadership did not require never making mistakes. It required creating conditions where others could speak before those mistakes became disasters. The orchard's recovery became structural rather than heroic, because neither Clara nor Adrian wanted survival to depend on another extraordinary rescue. Walter pleaded guilty to fraud and sabotage in exchange for testimony, although he continued denying involvement in the brake line and fire. Investigators ultimately proved Evelyn had hired a private contractor to stage the vehicle damage, while the record-shed fire resulted from Walter's attempt to destroy evidence without explicit instructions. Evelyn received no melodramatic redemption, yet Clara learned through Adrian that she had begun cooperating after months of denial. She never apologized in language capable of repairing what she destroyed, but she admitted that fear of losing family wealth had gradually allowed her to treat people, land, and memory as obstacles. Adrian visited her once before sentencing, not to forgive or punish, but to stop allowing unanswered questions to shape every family memory. He returned quieter, understanding that closure sometimes meant accepting an explanation without letting it become an excuse. The first full harvest after the investigation arrived beneath a clear October sky, covering the hills with red fruit and gold leaves. The yield remained lower than historic averages because Clara had sacrificed contaminated blossoms, yet tree survival exceeded every projection made during the emergency restoration. Buyers paid a premium after the orchard earned regenerative certification, and Adrian directed part of the profit into an employee emergency fund. Families gathered near the farmhouse for a harvest celebration that avoided the polished extravagance Evelyn once preferred. Folding tables held pies, roasted vegetables, coffee, and food brought from kitchens across the county, while children chased one another between hay bales under the watch of exhausted parents. The orchard sounded alive in ways Clara had not imagined when silence greeted her suitcase months earlier. Samuel Henderson attended the celebration after Clara invited him, and he laughed when she apologized again for declining his offer. He told her the Washington orchard had hired an excellent manager, then asked whether she ever regretted choosing uncertainty. Clara answered that she regretted needing desperation before she demanded professional respect, but she did not regret staying once the choice became genuinely hers. Samuel reminded her that recognizing one's value usually arrived later than possessing it. Before leaving, he handed her a small wooden sign from the nursery where she had worked, bearing the faded words, "Healthy things require room to breathe." Clara placed it inside the new training center, where apprentices would learn that horticulture concerned systems, patience, and attention rather than dramatic miracles. Near sunset, Adrian found Clara beside the oldest tree, examining the healed wound where Evelyn's blade had cut near the roots. New tissue had begun closing around the scar, although the mark would remain visible for years. Adrian said the tree reminded him of something Clara once told him about responsibility, and she teased that he had ignored most of her advice before learning to repeat it. Their conversations had grown warmer, without losing the honesty established during crisis. He had not transformed into a man free of control, grief, or suspicion, and Clara had not become fearless, because employment solved her immediate instability. They learned one another gradually, through disagreements about budgets, shared meals after long days, and quiet walks, where neither needed to perform gratitude. Adrian carried a small ring of antique brass keys, which Clara recognized as belonging to the main farmhouse. He explained that he intended to convert the guest cottage into temporary housing for agricultural trainees, arriving without local resources. Clara approved the plan, then asked why he was holding the house keys as though they required a speech. Adrian admitted he had rewritten the speech several times before realizing every version sounded like an employment benefit or emotional debt. He wanted her to live in the farmhouse, but only if she desired a life there beyond the orchard and beyond what they had survived together. Clara appreciated that he did not disguise a personal request as a reward, because shelter had once been the bargaining chip that placed her at a disadvantage. She asked what would happen if working together became difficult, and Adrian answered that difficulty required conversation rather than eviction. She asked whether he expected her to become responsible for healing every part of him, and he said he had finally learned that love was not unpaid restoration work. The answer made her laugh, although emotion tightened her throat. Clara accepted one key and left the others in his hand, telling him belonging should never mean losing the ability to leave. Adrian agreed, then asked whether she was staying. She looked toward the workers carrying the final crates, the cottage waiting for someone else's beginning, and the hills where thousands of trees moved beneath the evening wind. "I am not staying because I have nowhere else to go," she said. "I am staying because this is where I choose to build." Adrian kissed her gently beneath the tree his mother planted, without an audience, announcement, or promise larger than either could honestly make. The moment mattered because it arrived after respect, conflict, and difficult choices, rather than replacing them. When they returned to the celebration, nobody treated Clara as the woman Adrian had rescued or the stranger who saved him. She was the orchard's restoration director, a partner in its future, and a woman whose expertise had forced an entire community to reconsider whom they listened to. The harvest music continued after darkness covered the hills, while farmhouse windows cast warm rectangles across the courtyard where she had once stood with a suitcase and an impossible request. Years later, visitors would hear a simplified version of the story, usually about a homeless horticulturist who saved a dying orchard and found love with its guarded owner. Clara never corrected every romantic detail, but she always corrected the word miracle. The trees survived because people gathered evidence, admitted failures, challenged authority, accepted short-term sacrifice, and built systems stronger than individual loyalty. Adrian survived because he learned that honoring the dead did not require allowing grief to control the living. Clara found a home because she stopped treating acceptance as something she had to purchase through suffering. Beneath the oldest apple tree, the scar remained visible around the trunk, surrounded each spring by new blossoms that did not erase the wound but proved growth could continue around it. A home, Clara eventually understood, was not simply the first place that opened its door when the world became cold. It was the place where truth could enter without threatening belonging, where care did not demand self-erasure, and where leaving remained possible even after someone chose to stay. On quiet mornings, she still walked the lowest rows before sunrise, pressing her fingers into the soil and listening for problems invisible above ground. Sometimes Adrian joined her carrying 2 cups of coffee, no longer asking whether the trees had spoken because he had learned how carefully Clara listened. The orchard never returned to innocence, yet it became healthier than innocence had allowed, strengthened by transparency, accountability, and the people once dismissed as too ordinary to recognize danger. Every spring, when the first blossoms opened across the recovered hills, Clara remembered arriving with $27 and no guarantee of shelter, then smiled at the life that began when she refused to mistake being overlooked for having nothing worth seeing.